Well, today is Monday. It is June the 19th. My joy to come to you with today's Heart of a Shepherd devotion. The title, Ruth, a testimony of sovereignty and providence. Our scripture reading is Ruth chapters 1 and 2. Now, just a word of introduction. I apologize for the background noise as I am continuing with my parents in Monroe, North Carolina, and yet trying to continue to be a blessing to those of you who are the regular followers of Heart of a Shepherd. Well, the book of Ruth bridges two eras. Its historical context is in the time and the days when the judges ruled Israel, but before kings reigned in the land. It is a book beloved by Jewish people and Bible believers alike, and it also established the ancestry of King David and the genealogy of Jesus Christ in the lineage of David as a descendant of the tribe of Judah. And so in our brief study of this book, really only 4 chapters long, you're going to see a testimony of God's sovereignty and be reminded that He overrules man's affairs and is providentially ever working out His will through the infirmity of human decisions. Now, the book of Ruth is also a testament to the Lord's redemption, for it reveals how Ruth, a Moabite woman with no right of inheritance among God's people, came to be named in the lineage of Jesus Christ. It is indeed one of the wonderful yet brief books of the Old Testament. Well, in Ruth chapter 1, we look first of all at what I would describe as a prodigal family. Look with me, Ruth chapter 1 and verses 1 through 4. Now here we have the opening verses of Ruth introducing us to a family facing a faith crisis. Now we read, there was famine in the land. And so the decision was made to leave Bethlehem, Judah, and that is Bethlehem, a village of Judah, and travel to the country of Moab. Well, to escape the famine, Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and sons Mahlon and Chilion, descendants of Ephraim, moved to Moab, where they lived for 10 years. And yet calamity followed Elimelech's decision to leave Bethlehem, for he died in Moab, leaving Naomi a widow with 2 sons. Well, Naomi and her sons continued to live in Moab, and Naomi's sons took Moabite wives. Well, one of those Moabite wives was by the name of Ruth. And you find as you study this passage that Ruth obviously becomes a principal character, although she was a Moabite. Now, then consider with me Ruth chapter 1, verses 5 through 9, what I would describe as Naomi's sorrows. Now, tragedy again struck Naomi. Not only had her husband died, but now she loses both of her sons. They both die. Now, she and her daughter-in-laws, according to verse 5 of chapter 1, were widows. Well, understanding the day's culture and that widows had no social welfare, the 3 women faced a desperate, uncertain future. When Naomi heard the famine was past, she set her heart to return home to Bethlehem. Though she is a widow, though she has lost both sons, her longing was to go home. Well, Naomi then turned and she urged her daughters-in-law to return to their parents and hoped they might marry Moabite men. And yet we read Ruth and Orpah, the other daughter-in-law, refused. And they set their hearts on accompanying Naomi to Israel. Nevertheless, she blessed and encouraged them to go home. Go back to Moab. Seek a husband. And yet we see in verses 10 through 17 the wonderful, strong bond of love between Naomi and Ruth especially. Now, the bond of love between Naomi and her daughters-in-law was strong. And as they parted, we read they lifted up their voice and wept, verses 10 through 14. But we also read that Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, and she departed, the other daughter-in-law, and went back into her people. And watch this, verse 15, and unto her gods. Those are the heathen gods of the Moabite people. Ruth, however, refused to go back. She refused to leave Naomi. In one of the great confessions of faith in the scriptures, Ruth said to Naomi, and I quote, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go. Where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." Verse 17, "Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." What a wonderful testimony, not only of Ruth's commitment to Naomi, her mother-in-law, but also of Ruth's commitment to the God of Israel, whom Naomi worshiped. Now, although Ruth was a Moabite and therefore outside God's covenant with Israel, verse 18, Naomi accepted her promise, Ruth's promise of fidelity, that is faith, and they journeyed together, verse 19, to Bethlehem. Well, it's interesting, as they entered the village of Bethlehem, the people were stirred by their appearance, and some questioned, is this Naomi? Now notice with me then verses 20 through 22, what I would describe as the toll of sorrows and the sovereignty of God. Now 10 years of sorrow had taken their toll, and Naomi's physical appearance undoubtedly revealed her hardships and disappointments. Naomi, evidencing the sorrows of her sojourn from the promised land to Moab, answered the inquiries of her neighbors as she confessed, "Call me not Naomi," that is pleasant, "call me Mara," bitter. "For the Almighty El Shaddai hath dealt very bitterly with me." Verse 21, "The Lord, Jehovah, eternal, the self-existent one, hath testified against me, and the Almighty El Shaddai, the eternal, all-powerful God, he hath afflicted me." Providentially, notice how Naomi and Ruth's arrival in Bethlehem coincided with the beginning of barley harvest. Now that brings us to Ruth chapter 2. And here we read about the providence of God. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Now, although Ruth was a Moabite woman and a stranger amid God's people, the Lord used Naomi's wisdom to sovereignly direct Ruth, her daughter-in-law, to the fields of Boaz. Now, Boaz is described as a mighty man, wealthy, a kindred of Naomi and Elimelech, her deceased husband. Well, true to her faithful and industrious character, Ruth went out to glean grain in the fields belonging to Boaz, as Naomi had instructed her. When Boaz came to visit the workers in his field, he found an unfamiliar person among them, and he asked, "Whose damsel is this?" Now, beginning to read at verses 4 through 7, notice with me Ruth's industrious character. Now, the servant supervising the field workers identified Ruth as the Moabitish damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab. That's found in verse 6 of chapter 2. The servant then went on to explain how Ruth had requested to join the poor and glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. Now the servant commented, "She came, hath continued even from the morning until now, that she tarried a little in the house." In other words, we see the industry of Ruth in verse 7. Now Boaz would soon realize that Ruth was more than a pretty face. She was a woman of exceptional character. Notice then verses 8 through 23, Boaz's favor, and that is, he is in this passage and in this book, Boaz is a model of God's grace. Now, understanding Ruth was a widow of Naomi's kindred, Boaz demonstrated God's grace and love for sinners, of whom Ruth, coming from Moab, would have been considered a heathen woman by her background. And Boaz, then, we notice, spoke kindly to Ruth. He insisted that she labor only in his field and among his maidens, where she would find both provision and safety. Well, humbled by his favor, Ruth then fell before Boaz and asked, "Why? Why have I found grace in thine eyes, that thou shouldest take a knowledge of me, seeing," verse 10, "I am a stranger?" Boaz then acknowledged Ruth's testimony in Bethlehem and how she had left her country, her kindred, and accompanied Naomi to a land and people she did not know. Well, Boaz realized Ruth was a woman of faith and prayed she would be rewarded by the Lord and enjoy his favor. Well, Ruth then accepted Boaz's expression of grace with humility in verse 13. In a display of affection for Ruth, Boaz invited her to his table, that is, his place where he would eat. And she, however, though, with that sense of modesty, took her place not with Boaz, the master of the field, but with the reapers, those who were the hired servants. And she ate enough, we read, to satisfy her hunger, and yet she left some leftovers to bring home to Naomi. Well, a closing thought for you, and it is this, that we would take notice of this wonderful display, this wonderful testimony of grace. Now, in closing, I want to invite you to consider 3 ways that Boaz displayed grace to Ruth. The first is he offered her protection, and he charged the men in verse 9 that they would not touch her. And then verses 15 through 16, he made provision for her and her hands full of grain as she would have departed and gone home to Naomi. And finally, we see the promotion and that Ruth was the object of Boaz's attention and his affection. Well, in the closing verses of chapter 2, verses 18 through 23, we have Ruth's report to Naomi. You see, that evening when Ruth came home to Naomi, she revealed how Boaz had blessed her. Now, when Naomi realized the probability of the Lord's leading, she rejoiced and encouraged Ruth, verse 21 through 23, dispelling her bitterness with the hope of redemption. As you and I will see, this book, which began with famine, death, sorrow, and bitterness, will become a remarkable story of hope, love, and redemption. Well, thank you for following this Heart of a Shepherd. I know there's been a lot of background noise, and I hope that you overlook that, and at least what we have studied today might prove to be a blessing and an inspiration regarding God's grace, His love, and His redemption. The Lord bless you, and thank you for being a part of our time together. God bless, and bye-bye.